Old John Brown's body lies molding in the grave, while weep the sons of bondage whom he ventured out to save. And though he lost his life in his struggle to free the slaves, his truth is marching on. John Brown's body lies molding in the grave.
Hello and welcome to this America 1803 to 90 revision lesson 1, which focuses on the element of the course which is about sectional tension from 1850 to 61 and the Civil War from 1861 to 1865. You will need the revision lesson template and link to revision notes and essay plans and other documents, and you will have either been sent that or you will find a link to it in the description at the bottom of this video. This revision lesson is going to take you through an overview of the sectional tension section of the course, an overview of the Civil War section of the course, and then it is going to introduce you to the key skills of answering 10-mark answers, and it's going to give you some practice and some flashcards that you can use to help you with that. And it's then going to look at how you prepare to write some essays and how you practice the skill of analysis. So get the resources that you need and get ready, and we're going to start with sectional tension from 1850 to 61. Okay, so this revision lesson and the resources attached to it are going to basically help you go through a 4-step process to becoming more proficient at the study of this particular module and more proficient at the skills required to be successful. We are going to start by making revision notes, then we're going to learn the notes, then we're going to apply that learning to some focused skills tasks, and finally we'll practice 10-mark answers and essay planning. So it is not essential that you do all of this lesson in one. There is no way that you'll be able to sit down and do all of those 4 steps. This video lesson and the other revision lesson on 1803 to 90 are designed to introduce you to the different steps, and you can take those steps at different times. What we're going to start with, what we're going to focus on, is the actual knowledge, and so there is a short overview film for the sectional tension 1850 to 61 module. Okay, so I've made a little overview for each of the elements of this course. This is not supposed to be some kind of in-depth explanation. There's not every single aspect of the course included in these little films, but they should help to jog your memory. They should help to provide a nice overview before you start doing some of the revision. We know that the sectional tension 1850 to 61 element of this module focuses on those 11 years, but we also know that we need a longer term understanding of where that tension came from. And part of that longer term understanding is rooted in the presence of slavery in America and the impact that slavery had on the relationship between the North and the South. It is inconceivable that there would have been the extent of sectional tension that there was between the North and the South without the presence of slavery. The long-term economic differences, the cultural differences, the political differences can all be traced back to slavery in some way. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 can be seen as the first really political manifestation of the tension between North and South over the future shape of the country as westward expansion increased. So we see with Missouri applying to be a state, the danger of that sectional balance between North and South being disturbed, and that tension caused as a result of that led to the Missouri Compromise, with Missouri coming in as a slave state, Maine coming in as a free state, and then that line of latitude across the country, that imaginary line of separation between slavery and freedom, being drawn to try and deal with this problem going forward. Now, we know that this problem is not dealt with, and whilst Southerners at the time of 1820 are quite pleased that they've won some sort of concession and they've been able to get Missouri in as a slave state, the price that they have paid for that in the longer term, which their sons and grandsons consider later on in the 1850s and 60s, the price that they have paid is that they have created an area of the Louisiana Purchase in the northwest area of that Louisiana Purchase where slavery is not supposed to go. And the Missouri Compromise line does not solve this problem because it still doesn't deal with what's going to happen to other land that might be ceded to the United States over time. So when we have the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 48, and we have the Mexican Cession, and all of the land in the West that is then ceded to the United States, this issue of whether or not this land is going to be slave or free comes back again. And the issue of whether California is going to be a free state, the issue over the size of Texas, what's going to happen with Texas, what's going to happen with that, whether that's going to become how big a slave state that's going to be, where you're going to draw the border. All of these issues erupt as a result of the Mexican Cession, and the Missouri Compromise line does not really speak necessarily to those issues, and the popular sovereignty fudge that both sides agree on in the Compromise of 1850, that some land will come in as free, that Texas's debt will be assumed by the United States, the different parts of the Compromise of 1850 that benefit the North and the South. But fundamentally, the idea of popular sovereignty moving forward, that the people in the territories will decide whether a particular area is going to be slave or free, that similarly does not deal with the issue. And fundamentally, neither the Missouri Compromise or the Compromise of 1850 can deal with that issue. Lincoln said in 1858, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. We cannot permanently endure half slave and half free." And ultimately, none of the compromises up to the point of 1850 really work, because they haven't dealt with that fundamental problem of slavery, which divides the nation, divides North and South in many, many different ways. Now, after the Compromise of 1850, we do see something of a quieting of the issues surrounding slavery. There are no major issues that emerge in the early 1850s. The 1852 election sees both parties agree on the Compromise of 1850, and generally there is no appetite for the reopening of sectional issues. However, we still see some problems that exist. We see Uncle Tom's Cabin, published in 1852, which is Harriet Beecher Stowe's expose of slavery. That causes outrage in the North. It creates a lot of tension with the South. That, alongside the Fugitive Slave Law, which was part of the Compromise of 1850, which requires northern states to deliver up slaves that have escaped back to their masters, means that this issue of slavery in the popular consciousness does not disappear, and the forces of abolition and the forces of anti-slavery grow in the early 1850s around the moral issue of slavery. But still, the political consensus largely holds until the 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act. This, for me, is the crucial moment in this period, 1850 to 61. It is crucial because it opens up the Kansas-Nebraska Act the theoretical possibility that slavery could go above the Missouri Compromise line. It misuses the popular sovereignty provision in the Compromise of 1850 and tries to apply it to that land above the old Missouri Compromise line. Now, because the Whig Party has been weakened by immigration, because there are problems with the Whig Party, and because the political system is not as robust as it might appear on the surface after the 1850 midterms and the 1852 election, what happens is that the KansasNebraska Act is able to smash the Whig Party in two. Northerners just cannot stomach the KansasNebraska Act. They cannot, whether they're Democrats or whether they're Whigs, they cannot get with the idea that slavery might possibly go above the old Missouri Compromise line, and it is the KansasNebraska Act that sparks the emergence, it's the direct cause of the emergence of the Republican Party. And the emergence of the Republican Party provides a grave and mortal danger to the Union, because we have an avowedly sectional party, a party of Lincoln, but actually Lincoln is more moderate than many Republicans who are much more critical of the slavery system in the South and much more fanatical in their desire to end slavery. But the Republicans and their supporters have a very clear critique of the South. Not just a critique of the South morally, but a critique of the South economically, because they think that slavery is an inefficient form of labor. They have a critique of the South in terms of political philosophy and ideology, because they believe that a slave economy and a slave society is not a good Republican society. It's not a good democratic society, and it does not lead to a strong and healthy democracy. And so we see an anti-Southern critique. We see a free soil doctrine and a free soil ideology which at every turn criticizes slavery. And it's not just an ideology which actually is based on anti-slavery because they think it's morally wrong. A lot of people who supported the free soil doctrine want the West to have free soil for white people to enjoy. They do not want slavery to drive down wages and to degrade the body politic. For many people, free soil is a call to arms for white people to protect the West from the spread of slavery and the spread of African Americans. So the Republicans are a broad church. They are a big tent under which many different anti-Southern, pro-free soil opinions can exist. And the really important thing about the collapse of the two-party system and the rise of the Republican Party is that we have a sectional party now. The emergence of the Republican Party does not make it inevitable that there is going to be a civil war, but it does make it inevitable that should this Republican Party grow in strength, and we know in 1856 they make a very good showing in their first presidential election, we know that the caning of Sumner and all of the tension surrounding issues in Kansas are a great source of encouragement for people to vote for the Republicans. The Republicans use the caning of Sumner and the issues in Kansas to their political advantage to show the evil of the slave power and to show the evil of the Southern system, which they think is perverting democracy and perverting the Republican experiment. So the emergence of the Republican Party means that there is going to be some kind of political crisis as long as that Republican Party continues to grow. Because if a Republican Party wins a presidential election, as they do in 1860, and half of the country, i.e. Southern slaveholding states, have not voted for them, then we have some sort of political crisis. A political system is designed, if it's effective, to try and find a solution to some of the most vexing problems in a particular country. The problem, once the Republican Party has emerged and become established after 1856, is that the American political system cannot contain the sectional forces that have been unleashed with westward expansion and the issue of whether or not the future of the country should be slave or free. So we see in Bleeding Sumner and Bleeding Kansas, and then we see in the Dred Scott decision in 1857, we see issues that divide the nation based on whether or not the country's future should be slave or should be free. The Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858 very clearly show the difference between Republicans who believe that slavery is wrong, both morally, economically, politically, socially, and Democrats who, clinging to the popular sovereignty doctrine that they hope will help to keep the Democratic Party together, don't really have any strong opinions on slavery and are ambivalent about the cause of slavery and say that it'll just be up to the people in the territories to decide. We see in the John Brown raid of 1859 the southern fears of a slave rebellion sparked by northern hostility come alive, and for the Republicans, their bogeyman is the slave power, but for southern slaveholders and their supporters, the bogeyman of the Republic is in fact the Republican Party and the black republicanism that they think is going to try and abolish slavery and bring social and political equality for black people in the South. And so when Lincoln is elected in 1860, the tension that has developed since the KansasNebraska Act and the emergence of the Republican Party, that tension cannot be contained by the political system anymore, and South Carolina secedes even before the end of 1860, and then 6 more southern states secede in that secession winter of 1860-61 before Lincoln has even set foot in the White House and before he has been sworn in as president. And these southern slave states that secede do so amidst a crisis of fear in which they believe that the only way to protect slavery is to leave the Union, and that slavery is going to be more protected leaving the Union than staying in the Union. The northern southern states and the border states, and most importantly Virginia, do not secede until after the firing on Fort Sumter in March in the spring of 1861, and it's that firing on Fort Sumter and the refusal of the Lincoln administration to allow the South to secede and the denial of the legal ability to secede that sparks the Civil War. And so tension increases between 1850 and 61 because of the slavery issue, but not just because of slavery. Tension increases because of the politicization of the slavery issue and because of the failure of the American political system to contain that slavery issue. And what develops in the 1850s is some sort of schizophrenic nationality, some sort of crisis of national identity, whereby the politicization of the slavery issue means that those in the North and those in the South increasingly come to see the future of America in very different terms. And a northern nationalism and a southern nationalism develops in the 1850s, and it's that divergence of opinion about the future of the country which then leads to civil war. So is slavery the root cause of the sectional tension 1850 to 61? Of course it is. But the real reason that tension increases so much that it leads to civil war, because remember, slavery has existed since the founding of the United States and has not yet prompted war. The reason that it happens in the 1850s, that the tension increases so much that it then leads to civil war, is because of the politicization of the slavery issue, and it's the inability of the political system to contain that sectional tension any further. And the pivotal moment in the 1850s is the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the emergence of the Republican Party as a direct result of that. Okay, so that gives you an overview of the key issues in the sectional tension 1850 to 61 aspect of the course, and it covers the issues that are listed here that come directly from the exam board. What we need to be able to do is to recall knowledge about those specific aspects of this element of the course. We need to make some revision notes to help us do that, and then we need to learn the notes. You will find on pages 3, 4 and 5 of your lesson note template these revision maps. You've probably seen them before. They cover the key aspects of the sectional tension area of the course. In this particular case, they go back to 1848, even though the exam board requires you to know 1850 to 61. In fact, they go back as far as 1820 with the Missouri Compromise to provide a bit of background before you move into the 1850s. What you need to do as part of your revision is you need to basically learn this information. Now, it's a bit forbidding, the information in this format, so you need to make your own revision notes, basing those revision notes around the key issues listed under the sectional tension 1850 to 61 heading here, and then you need to learn those notes. So you make the revision notes in whichever format helps you, and then you need to learn them. You can do that by reading them, covering them, writing them out from memory, checking to see what you got correct. That's the first two stages of the revision process, to make some revision notes and to learn them. Now, the next stage of the revision process is to start to actually use that knowledge and apply it to specific types of questions that you'll have to do in the exam. So here's an example of a 10-mark question. Which of the following was of greater importance in generating northern hostility towards the South in the years 1850 to 61? The Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 or the Dred Scott Decision of 1857? What you need to be doing, therefore, is looking at the ways in which the Fugitive Slave Law generated northern hostility and the ways in which the Dred Scott Decision generated northern hostility, thinking about the relative significance of each, which one of them created the most hostility, before you reach a judgment. So if we think about the sectional tension 1850 to 61 part of the course, we can then consider what the focus of future questions might be. It might be about causing northern hostility, as we've seen there. It could be causing southern hostility. It could be increasing sectional tension. It could be causing the Civil War. It could be causing the breakdown of the political system or causing southern secession. Now, what you have are some flashcards to help you with this aspect of the course. There is a link to these flashcards in the lesson notes booklet, and they look quite a lot like this. So again, as part of your revision process, you need to have a look at these flashcards. You need to learn some of the information. Some of it will be very familiar to you because you'll have covered it as part of your revision notes and learning those revision notes. But then what you could start to do is to start to annotate these flashcards in a way that helps you to develop some analysis in relation to specific. So for example, you look through the flashcards and you might look at the ones that might have caused northern hostility, and you might start to annotate on those flashcards the extent to which they caused northern hostility. Think about which of the relevant flashcards was the greatest cause of northern hostility. You might do the same for the ones that are relevant to southern hostility or causing southern secession. You're not going to use every single flashcard in relation to every single focus because some of them won't be appropriate. But you need to start, as part of your revision process, applying your knowledge to the skill of analysis. In this case, it's analyzing the relative significance of different events or factors in relation to a specific focus in the question. So that would be the next stage of your revision process. Once you're comfortable with the material and you've learned your notes, start to then think about how you might apply that to a 10-mark answer. Okay, on page 7 of your lesson notes template, you'll find this page, Analyze That. Now, we know that the key skill in 10-mark and essay answers is analysis. How do we use our knowledge to support an analytical argument in relation to a statement or a proposition? Many essay questions are assess the reasons for this, or blah, 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 how far do you agree, or to what extent? And so the real skill is to be able to produce an analytical response. So we've got lots of propositions or statements here that you can use to help you practice that skill of analysis in relation to sectional tension 1850 to 61. Let's look at a particular example and see what we mean by how we might use these propositions to help us develop some skills of analysis. So we've got the South was mainly to blame for increasing sectional tension. And what you should do as a revision activity is jot down on a page some ideas as to what agrees and what disagrees with that proposition. So the South was to blame. Well, slavery was a huge cause of sectional tension, and the South's desire to maintain slavery was a huge cause of sectional tension. The caning of Sumner was essentially Southerners' response to Northerners, or in a particular case, one particular Northerner, Charles Sumner, attacking the institution of slavery. We know that slavery was central to the very fabric of Southern society, economy, and political structure. So, yes, the South was desperate to maintain slavery, and of course, that helped to antagonize the North. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, the line in the Kansas-Nebraska Act that made the Missouri Compromise line null and void, and so infuriated Northerners, was insisted upon that that line was in the legislation by Southern senators. So, in that sense, we can see that the South is undoubtedly a cause of sectional tension. However, we cannot say that the South was mainly to blame, that the South was the main cause for increasing the sectional tension, because actually the sectional tension was also fueled by a growing Northern identity, a growing Northern free soil national identity, and the Republican Party helped to politicize the slavery issue in order to gain traction in the North politically and in order to get elected, in order to fulfill their idea about what the future of America should look like. So the Republican Party were responsible for increasing sectional tension. And you could argue, given that slavery existed before the Republican Party and that the South's desire to maintain slavery existed before the Republican Party, that to say that it was the South that was mainly to blame for increasing sectional tension is ignorant of the fact that sectional tension increased markedly after the mid 1850s, and that sectional tension was so palpable because of the emergence of an avowedly anti-Southern, anti-slavery party in the Republican Party. So we can see that by using the knowledge that you have acquired in the first two steps of your revision process, so learning the material, you can then begin to use that material to practice and rehearse some analysis, which would help when you are answering essay questions. And what is crucial about producing a highly successful essay is to have a line of argument which is driven by that analysis. So analysis is the key skill. That's what the top of the mark scheme is looking for. It says that knowledge and understanding is demonstrated throughout the answer and is constantly evaluated and analyzed in order to reach substantiated, developed, and sustained judgments. So it's that constant analysis of the material. It's using the knowledge in order to further an argument and reach a judgment, which is the real skill when answering an essay. And that's the thing that you need to practice once you have become confident that you can recall the material. On page 9 of your lesson notes booklet, you have a list of potential essay questions on the sectional tension 1850 to 61 element of the course. There is also a link to some essay plans that have been produced in response to those questions. So you can have a go at practicing some analysis, either writing out a plan or writing out an answer in full, and then you can compare that with the essay plans that I've prepared in advance in response to those questions. It is not the case that my essay plans represent the correct answer and that no other opinions or lines of argument or ways of answering the question are correct. It's just that they give you something to check against to see if the structure of your answer and the knowledge that you've used is along the right lines. And what's important is the bit in italics at the end of each of the columns towards the bottom of that essay plan there. That's the analysis that is driving the overall argument forward in each of the essay plans. So you can have a go at planning some, have a go at writing some essays even, and you can check them against the plans that have already been prepared. And there's a plan prepared for every one of the questions that are listed on page 9 of your lesson notes booklet. Alright, this represents the end of the sectional tension 1850 to 61 element of this revision lesson. As I said at the start, it is not expected that you are going to sit down for hours on end in one go and do all of the things that have been suggested in this video. There are some ideas about how you can take your revision forward for sectional tension 1850 to 61. We will now be moving on to look at the Civil War aspect of this course. Right, so we're now going to move on to do some revision of the Civil War 1861 to 65 section of the course. Again, we start with a little overview film that paints in broad brushstrokes the picture of this particular aspect of the course. The Civil War from 1861 to 65 claimed 600,000 American lives and left a massive, massive scar on the nation's political, social, economic history. It was a monumental conflict, possibly the first modern industrialized war that the world has ever seen. So, we need to consider several things when we're looking at the Civil War. We need to consider why the North won and why the South lost. And we need to consider those overarching issues that explain that, but we also need to explain the course of the war. So at the beginning of the war, both Lincoln and Davis call for volunteers, and as the war goes on, it's obvious that they're going to need more and more men, and conscription is brought in both the North and the South. Now, the first major battle, the first Bull Run battle, it's a bit of a spectator sport for people near Washington who go out to watch this, thinking that this is going to be a quick conflict with a quick battle and the war will be over. In reality, this is the beginning of what is going to be a very long and protracted war, and as the Union troops retreated back towards Washington in some chaos and disarray, then members of the public who'd come out to watch the battle were mixed up with them, and the whole scene was chaotic. And the Southern Army that had been victorious, the Confederate Army that had forced the Union Army from the field, was unable to follow up and actually mobilize and get their logistics sorted out to be able to follow the Union troops back to Washington. So it became clear quite early on that this was not going to be a quick conflict, and these huge armies that the Union and the Confederacy had were going to be very hard to mobilize to achieve a quick and decisive victory. Lincoln's problems were that the general that he was searching for to try and prosecute the type of war that the Union needed didn't appear to be out there in the first few years of the war. And we know that George B. McClellan, who was the commander during the Peninsula Campaign and was the main Union commander during 1862, was not an effective general for the circumstances the war was fought in. And once Robert E. Lee assumed command of the Southern Army after the Second Bull Run of 1862, then it became obvious that McClellan was not going to be able to achieve a victory. Lee was daring. Lee was looking for the knockout punch that the South needed to be able to win the war, and he was prepared to split his forces and do all kinds of innovative and daring things in a way that McClellan just simply was not prepared to do. And the difference between Lincoln and McClellan's view of the war spoke to a wider split in the North about what the meaning of the war was. Lincoln realized quite quickly that the war was going to go on for some time, and the scope of the war was going to need to be expanded, that the South was going to need to be occupied and was going to need to be forced back into the Union, whereas McClellan wanted to fight a less expansive war and was more inclined to not see the war growing to include emancipation and not growing to see a vast change in the relationship between the North and the South, or a massive change in the lives of the respective populations of the North and the South. Much of the focus of the war in 1862 and 1863, in fact much of the focus of the war full stop, has been on the Eastern Theatre. It's been on the campaigns by the Union to try and take Richmond and the campaign by the Confederacy to try and take Washington. But in actual fact, some of the most decisive battles of the war were taking place in the West. And it's in the West that we see some of the first Union victories in the late winter, early spring of 1862, when Fort Henry and Fort Donelson are captured, when Nashville is captured. What Grant, who is commanding forces in the West, realizes after the Battle of Shiloh in the spring of 1862 is that this is going to be a war that is going to grind on for a long time. He realizes that the South is not going to negotiate and is not going to be able to be sort of brought back into the Union because of some sort of negotiation. The South is going to need to be occupied and forced back into the Union, and it's this realization that Lincoln has already had, and it's later on in the war that Lincoln and Grant work so effectively together because they have a similar idea of the scope of the conflict and what is needed to succeed. So by the time we get to the end of 1862, we see that the Union are in trouble because they cannot find a general to take on Robert E. Lee. The Battle of Fredericksburg in the autumn of 1862 leads to terrible, terrible Union losses as they advance on well-entrenched Confederate forces and are mown down in the process. It doesn't seem that anything that the Union throw at Robert E. Lee is effective, and in fact Robert E. Lee, with a much smaller force, seems to be running rings around the Union army. And at the same time, there are problems on the home front for Lincoln. Now, ultimately, one of the reasons that Lincoln wins the war for the Union is that he is a better president and a better politician than Jefferson Davis. Lincoln is able to work with people who disagree with him. Lincoln doesn't have the same ego that Jefferson Davis has. Lincoln is able to mobilize public opinion in support of the war effort. Jefferson Davis gets into spats with other politicians. Jefferson Davis tries to micromanage things in a way that Lincoln does not. Jefferson Davis is not able to articulate to the Southern people exactly what it is that they are fighting for in the same way that Lincoln is able to do in the North. And Davis has to deal with the problems in the South of states' rights. So we have states that seceded from the Union in order to protect themselves from a centralized federal government, and those states do not then want to work in a situation or work alongside a centralized government system in the Confederacy. So, especially Governors Brown of Georgia, Governors Vance of North Carolina, are very resistant to the efforts of Jefferson Davis and the Confederate government to organize conscription and to try and mobilize a unified Southern effort, and they prefer to act as individual states. Having said that, Lincoln is facing a problem in 1862 that Jefferson Davis does not face. Lincoln has realized already by the summer of 1862 that he will need to emancipate the slaves, that if he's going to develop a total war against the South, he needs to change the war aims from just bringing the South back into the Union to the aim of emancipating the slaves and transforming the South. And he has to walk a tightrope of Northern public opinion. He issues the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation after the Battle of Antietam in September of 1862, which says that if the southern states in rebellion have not returned to the Union by the 1st of January 1863, then all the slaves in those states will in fact be free. Now, the Republicans face losses in the midterm elections of 1862 because there's a lot of Northern opinion that's against the emancipation of slaves, and they don't like the growing scope of the war. McClellan, as a Democrat, is against this growing scope of the war and has already communicated this to Lincoln. But Lincoln argues that this is a time in which slavery must be ended, and that he argues that in giving freedom to the slave, then they assure freedom for the free. And he expands the scope of the war in 1862 and into 1863, even though actually the Emancipation Proclamation in itself does not free many slaves because the Southern Confederate States just ignore it. This is, for some people, seen as a bit of a desperation, even though he was advised not to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation until after a victory, which he did. There was a victory of sorts at Antietam, the defeat at Fredericksburg, and then the defeat in the spring of 1863 at Chancellorsville, where General Hooker is defeated by Robert E. Lee with a much smaller force in the wilderness in Virginia. It looks as though the war is going really badly for the North, and it looks as though all the South has to do is develop one more knockout blow, and the one more knockout blow will enable the Confederacy to be recognized internationally and will enable the Confederacy to gain independence from the rest of the United States. So, searching for this knockout victory, this decisive blow, Robert E. Lee decides to invade the North in 1863. He invades the North and he goes up to Pennsylvania, where in July of 1863 the Battle of Gettysburg takes place. Huge, monumental battle, the biggest single battle in the Western Hemisphere to that point, and the battle rages for 3 days, and Robert E. Lee is pushed back. Even though he's pushed back, much to Lincoln's frustration, General Meade does not chase Lee effectively, does not destroy Lee's army, and Lee is able to escape back into Virginia. However, on July 4th, 1863, after a tactical triumph in which he moved ahead of his supply lines and got his soldiers to forage from local areas in order to be able to keep moving quickly. Grant takes Vicksburg, and it's the victory at Vicksburg in the west and the victory at Gettysburg, even though it's not a decisive and total victory in the east, is probably it's probably the beginning of the end in some ways for the South. Those two victories in the summer of 1863, the Confederacy does not gain position of ascendancy in the conflict again that they enjoyed before the Battle of Gettysburg and the Battle of Vicksburg in 1863. Now, it's important to note that just because the Union was gaining the ascendancy on the battlefield, this doesn't mean that Lincoln's problems on the home front were no longer in existence. In fact, in the summer of 1863, we see the New York draft riots, where working class Democrats supporting citizens of New York protested at the draft. There were several days of riots where newspaper offices were burned down, lots of damage, but most notably many African Americans were assaulted and lynched. And what was clear is that among some of the northern population there was a rejection of the Emancipation Proclamation and a rejection of the expanded scope of the war. And Lincoln was always having to craft a message and always communicate what the purpose of the war was, and he had to do this in the face of opposition from those in the North who did not want the aims and the scope of the war to expand in the way that Lincoln and others envisaged. In the Western Theatre, in the rest of 1863, Grant was leading forces in an attempt to open up a route that would allow the Union forces to move on Georgia, so that then the Confederacy would be getting attacked from the southwest, as well as Richmond being attacked from the north. And at the Battle of Chickamauga in September of 1863, and then at the Battle of Chattanooga in November in 1863, although there was incredible loss of life on both sides, Chickamauga was the biggest battle of the Western Theatre. It was a bloodbath with over 20,000 men falling. Eventually, after the Battle of Chickamauga and the Battle of Chattanooga, then a path into Georgia was opened up, and the North had complete control of the Mississippi River to be able to move on the Confederacy. Now, in the autumn of 1863, Lincoln also went to a cemetery at Gettysburg to commemorate the men who had fallen in the Battle of Gettysburg in July of 1863. And it was in that commemoration ceremony at that cemetery in Gettysburg that Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address. And in this address, he changed totally the meaning of the war and spoke of a new birth of freedom for the United States that would come out of the conflict.
77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, We cannot dedicate. We cannot consecrate. We cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here, dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. That this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom. And that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
In 1864, Grant was made the commander of all Union forces, and he moved to the Eastern Theater of the war. Lincoln now had in place his general who understood the nature of total warfare and who had a strategy to beat the South in an attritional type of warfare, the type of attritional warfare that the Confederacy was not able to succeed against, because ultimately the resources and the logistical advantage and the manpower advantage of the Union would be brought to bear. However, in 1864, Lincoln's main difficulty, the main issue that would have stopped him from winning the war, came not from the southern attempts to defeat Union armies on the battlefield. It came from the problems he had at home. There was an election and the North was becoming war weary. But Grant had a strategy in 64, a three-pronged strategy to the South in the Shenandoah Valley. He had an attack directed at Robert E. Lee's forces in Virginia, and he put Sherman in charge in the west of trying to capture Atlanta. In spring of 1864, he faced Lee in the Battle of the Wilderness, and this was the first major confrontation between Grant and Lee. And one of the things that the exam board like to focus on sometimes is this contrast between the two, a comparison between the two, and they both were extremely talented commanders in their own right. What is correct to suggest is that they were both incredible strategists and tacticians in their own right, and that Robert E. Lee did an incredible job at keeping the Army of Northern Virginia going as long as he did, and coming as close to victory in some of the battles, and coming as close to a decisive victory as he did in some of the battles, made him an incredibly important general for the South. However, the advantage that Grant had was a unified system of command. He had a president who gave him incredible power as leader general of all of the Union forces, and he had considerable logistical and manpower advantages over Lee. What was crucial in the Battle of the Wilderness was that Grant did not stop attacking even when Robert E. Lee repulsed him, and the reality was that, unlike other generals, McClellan, that Robert E. Lee had come up against, Grant just continued to forge ahead and continue to attack Robert E. Lee in a way that would mean that Union forces having greater logistical and manpower advantages would come to bear in the end. And yet, Lincoln wrote a note to his cabinet in the summer of 1864 suggesting that he thought he was going to lose the election. And he may very well have lost the election, with Grant bogged down in the wilderness fighting against Lee, and with Sherman struggling in his efforts to take Atlanta. Had Sherman not captured Atlanta in the September of 1864, then it's quite possible that Lincoln would not have won re-election in that November of 1864, but he did, and he defeated McClellan, and he defeated the Peace Democrats who wanted to end the war. And at that point, with Lincoln's victory in 1864 election, that was the point when defeat was inevitable for the South, and it was at that point that it became obvious that Lincoln's view of what the war would be, Lincoln's view of the war ending slavery and an unconditional surrender of the South and an ending of slavery, was going to be the outcome of the war. So at that point, Lincoln's election in 1864, that is when Union victory became inevitable. Despite all that, it still took several more months to achieve victory. Sherman marched through Georgia in his infamous march to the sea, and he laid waste to many areas of the Georgia countryside, vowed to make the South sick of war. At the same time, Grant was dug in outside Petersburg in a siege, trying to find a way through to Richmond, and trying to grind down Robert E. Lee's forces. Eventually, with Sherman closing in from one side, Sheridan closing in from the other, Grant pushing and probing from another side, Lee had to surrender at Appomattox Courthouse in the spring of 1865. So why did the Union win the war? The Union won the war because they had Grant, who was a general who understood the type of warfare required. They had a president in Lincoln who was a political genius and who was able to mobilize Northern opinion and change the scope and the expanse of the war and change the aims of the war in a way that kept Northern public opinion on side. Remember, 70% of the soldiers who voted in the 1864 election voted for Lincoln, and in so doing voted to keep themselves on the battlefield until the war was won. And the Union brought with that better political leadership and quality military leadership, superior resources, logistics, and manpower. And when they had a political and military who were able to mobilize those resources, then they were able to win the war. That is not to say that Union victory was inevitable from the beginning, and there were several moments in the war where the Confederacy came very close to either achieving international recognition or causing public opinion in the North to turn so far against the war that the war would have been over and the North would have had to accept Southern independence. Okay, so once again, thinking about this revision process, first thing we need to do is to actually learn the material. We need to make some revision notes and learn it. We can see here under the Civil War section here all the different aspects of the Civil War that the exam board want us to focus on, and so this provides a template for how you can make your revision notes. Starting on page 10 of the lesson notes template, you will find 3 revision knowledge organizers for the civil rights element of the course, and you should use these alongside what you've just seen in the overview film, alongside your own notes, to make notes under the headings, under the key focuses that are outlined by the exam board, which is on the slide that I've just shown you. So you make your notes and then you learn them by doing read, cover, write and check. That's the first stage of the revision for this part of the course. So the focus of 10-mark questions, and here's an example on the Civil War. Which of the following was of greater importance in enabling Union victory? Was it the Battle of Gettysburg or was it the Battle of Vicksburg? So the key is to focus on a direct analysis of the importance of these battles in enabling Union victory before reaching a judgment. So if we consider the focus of possible future questions, then we might focus on enabling Union victory, we might focus on delaying Union victory, we might focus on causing problems for the Union war effort, or causing problems for the Southern war effort, or there might be a direct comparison between the leadership of Lincoln and Davis, or a direct comparison between military leaders like Lee and Grant, or maybe Lee and McClellan, or McClellan and Grant. So there are many directions in which they can take these comparisons. So if we think about how you would use your flashcards, and again there's a link there to your flashcards at the bottom of this page in your lesson notes template. Here's an example. You will begin to annotate these flashcards and begin to use them in relation to some of the potential focuses. Now, obviously, if it's a question directly about Lee and Grant, then you only need the flashcards on Lee and Grant. If it's about McClellan and Grant, or if it's about Lincoln and Davis, you only need those specific flashcards. But for different battles, you need to start to analyze the significance of them in terms of delaying Union victory, or helping with Union victory, or delaying the war, helping to explain why the South was able to keep the war going, causing problems for the South, etc., etc. You need to start to think about these flashcards not just as knowledge that you are learning, but you need to think about the flashcards in terms of how you analyze the relative importance and the relative significance of different events, or of different battles, or of different personalities in relation to a specific focus of the question. Again, if we think about the skill of analysis, so here we have the analyze that page from your lesson notes booklet in relation to the Civil War. We've got specific propositions or specific questions to analyze, and a good way of practicing the skill of analysis is to take one or more of these and to construct an argument for and against the proposition, or to construct an argument in relation to the specific question, but focusing your energies on analyzing and using knowledge to support that analysis rather than just recalling the knowledge itself. The recall is the first two stages of the revision process. What we're trying to do in this stage of the revision process is the application and analysis of material, which comes towards the end of that arching arrow. As you become more proficient with the material, as you become more confident with it, then you can start to analyze rather than just have to recall the information. It's a higher order skill to analyze than it is just to recall the information, but you can't do the analysis properly until you've got a good foundation of knowledge. So here's an example of an analyze that task. Lincoln was the main reason the Union won. Well, Lincoln was obviously a hugely important reason for Union victory. His political leadership, his ability to marshal the Northern war effort, his ability to traverse the incredibly tricky tightrope that he was walking in terms of expanding the scope of the war and pursuing the policy of emancipation, despite the fact that many Northerners were not on board with that, and still manage to win the 1864 election and to communicate a sense of purpose and a sense of aim for the war that Northerners were able to support. That's a hugely significant contribution to the Union war effort. However, the sheer advantage that the Union had in every resource and logistics category, and you can see that from the little table there in the bottom right, meant that once the political situation was managed well by Lincoln, there was ample opportunity for the Union to capitalize on the resources that they had. However, they would not have been able to do that without an effective general like Grant. Yes, Lincoln certainly deserves credit for promoting Grant and for seeing in Grant somebody who could execute a military strategy that would succeed, and he works well with Grant and he gives him plenty of freedom to prosecute the war in the way that he thinks is best, and Lincoln doesn't micromanage him, so that's a strength for Lincoln. But still, it needed Grant as a military personality to be able to carry the Union forward to victory. Lincoln was searching for a general for many years, and he made some mistakes. And he, he had McClellan in charge, and then he took McClellan out of the command, and he put him back in again, and he put Hooker and Meade. So Lincoln was searching for the right general. So that shows the importance of the general. Just the resources and just Lincoln's political skill were not enough without a successful general. And we must also factor in there, if we're looking at the blue bars on that graph of being Union advantage, that means the red bars are Confederate disadvantage. And the Confederacy was fighting a war that was a defensive war, and it was trying to defend a large amount of territory with significantly less resources than the Union had. And it was also hampered by slavery, and its desire to maintain slavery meant that it wasn't fully utilizing the manpower that it had at its disposal, and it wasn't able to prosecute the war in a more centralized and totally unified way as it might otherwise have been able to do had the slavery issue not have been so prominent. So what are we doing here? We're analyzing the relative significance of Lincoln compared with these other factors, and it's that analysis, it's that ability to use the knowledge to support a piece of analysis that is absolutely crucial. And it's a crucial skill to master because it is what the exam board are looking for in essay answers. It must be analysis that drives your answer. It must be analysis that carries your argument forward. And as it says in the mark scheme, knowledge and understanding is demonstrated throughout the answer, but it's consistently evaluated and analysed. There's no point in that knowledge unless it's being used to develop analysis. And you have in your lesson notes booklet for this lesson a list of essay questions that you can practice planning, writing in relation to the Civil War. And there is a link there to the essay plans that you can use to cross-reference your ideas with. And the essay plans look like this. You've seen them for the sectional tension element of this video, and again, it's the italicized sections at the bottom of each of the columns there. It is these that are driving the essay forward. We're not suggesting that this is the only way you can write this question, this answer to this question. We're not suggesting this is if you don't get your plan and your answer the same as this, then you're wrong. But we are suggesting that it's the style of analysis and the style of evaluation of the material that is crucial if you're to write a successful essay. So you can have a go at planning and writing, then you can cross-reference, or you can just learn some of the plans as well also, if that helps you to refine your arguments. Okay, that brings us to the end of the Civil War 1861-65 revision section of this video. Again, you're not supposed to try and do all of this in one go. You can keep returning to this video. You can keep returning to some of the skills and some of the ideas. And obviously, you need to do things in stages. You need to be making your own revision notes and learning them before you can then start doing some of the analysis and some of the essay planning and writing. Okay, so hopefully you have enjoyed this revision lesson. Hopefully it's helped you. Hopefully it's given you some ideas for the future of how you could do some more revision. You can keep coming back to this. You can keep coming back to the resources that you've been supplied with, and you can keep going over the material and practicing the skills so that you can become more and more proficient in both the recall of the knowledge, but also in being able to analyze and use that knowledge to support the analysis. So, until next time, take care, stay safe, goodbye.
Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth went marching on. The conflict that he heralded, he looks down from heaven to view on the army of the Union with its flag red, white, and blue. And heaven shall ring with anthems o'er the deeds they mean to do, for his truth still